Greetings, this is Management 430, Human Resource Management, and this is the introductory lecture on what is human resource management. Moving to slide 2, you can see that there are a whole variety of different definitions for what is human resource management, but there's one overlying theme. It has to do with people, and it has to do with them achieving organizational goals. So what HR actually does is it helps create systems to manage people so that the organization can complete its goals. The goal is to do it effectively and to do it efficiently, and also to ensure that it is consistent with what the organization's goals and strategies are. And we'll talk more about strategy as we get into the next couple of chapters. But human resource management, the goal of HR, is really to design all of the systems that employers will use, and they design these systems to help manage employees the best way that they can. From there, the employees can go about doing the work on a daily basis, doing the work of the organization, but at the same time making sure that they are working within the systems that the organization set up. And those systems include things like rules and policies and procedures, and we'll talk a little bit more about those towards the end of this lecture. But generally speaking, HR designs the system and management implements the system. So the next slide, the HR function in this chapter, we talk about the different places where the HR department is actually found. It can be found in-house, or it could be outsourced. Most organizations have at least some functional HR person, but there are some situations where the entire HR discipline is outsourced. Let's start though with talking about the in-house stuff. In the in-house stuff, in smaller organizations, typically the CEO or someone in the top management team is involved in managing HR, and it's not necessarily an HR professional, but it could be the chief operations officer or the chief executive officer or anybody in that C-suite. Somebody else takes on that role. They're not specifically called the head of HR. They are called the head of finance or the head of accounting or the head of budgets or what have you, operations. You can also have your own standalone department, and when you have your standalone department, then you typically see an HR director or an HR professional who's at the lead of that. In a standalone department, you can either have that HR professional working at the C-suite level, chief people officer, chief human resource management officer. It could be all sorts of different sort of C-suite names. Or the HR department could function under the chief financial officer, the chief operation officer. The basic difference between the two, why you might see one versus the other, when an organization really values human resource management and they're engaged in investing in their employees and in terms of their strategies and in terms of what they need for training and development, that company is more likely to have somebody at the C-suite level because they really do value the impact that the C-suite title gives to HR. They value what HR can bring to the table and what HR can do to benefit organizations. So at that C-suite level, again, we call it the chief people officer. And we see these C-suites in companies like Yahoo and in Google and in Southwest Airlines, right? These are people that work at the top management team, and this is a company that values people as much as they value money or operations or marketing or any of the other C-suite positions. When you see your HR department under your CFO or your COO, it means they really don't value the impact that HR has. They see HR as much more of a cost center than a place where they could find a competitive advantage. So if they're under the CFO, then it's really about managing expenses, right? Because the CFO is responsible for finance and accounting and things like that. If they're under the COO, the chief operating officer, they just see that as one of many resources that people manage that managers will have to manage, but at the same time, they don't put the same emphasis on how important it is to have someone representing the employees and representing the competitive advantage that employees can bring to the table, at the C-suite level. So it doesn't mean that the company treats their employees poorly. They might, but they don't necessarily have to do that if they're under the CFO or the COO. But what we're more likely to see is less of an emphasis on investment in human resources and in human capital. We're less likely to see an emphasis on doing what it takes to help our employees be better performers, and you're more likely to see the company think about employees as simply a cost center and nothing else. From the outsourced perspective, however, with the HR function, it's rare, but you can have the entire HR department outsourced to an organization such as a leasing company, and the leasing company then leases the employees back to the organization. So all the HR activities, the training, the development, the payroll, the benefits, all those things are under the leasing company's aegis, and all the employer needs to do is have these employees come, kind of like temporary employees, where they come in and they do the work, and that's it. Even though it's a financial agreement or a financial arrangement in terms of how it's managed, you do find that companies are sort of a bit removed from their investment in employees. They don't really think about the investment in their employees in the same way. What's more common is outsourcing part of the activities, things like recruiting and selecting. Employment agencies will do all the recruiting and the pre-selection of potential employees for jobs. You pay them a fee and then they find job candidates for you. You can do payroll, and that's one of the more common outsourced functions, where you provide the money to someone like Paychex, and Paychex takes care of all of the payroll responsibilities for getting the checks to the employees. You just send them a lump sum, and then they take care of all of the payroll taxes and paying any vendors they need to for benefits and things like that. Training and development is also fairly common. Companies, no matter what size they are, may not have in-house expertise on a particular area to train people. So it's easier to bring in a training and development expert to come in and to do the training for a fee for you. This is particularly important for smaller businesses, because smaller businesses don't always have the resources to have somebody in-house to do training anyway. So outsourcing any one of these things can be really helpful. In terms of who else does HR, the formal HR function is typically divided either among the HR professional or the top management team or some sort of outsourced resource, but doing general HR activities also falls to you as managers, anybody who wants to be a future manager. Managers are responsible for helping with recruiting and helping select employees and helping to evaluate them and helping to train them. So even though the formal HR job is done by somebody that may be in the C-suite or maybe in their own HR department, HR activities themselves are done by pretty much every employee in the company. And so what we'll talk about as we go through this class is what role all employees play in doing HR. Management plays a role, HR plays a role, and employees play a role in how all of this is managed. And so that's the emphasis of this class, is helping you to understand that as future employees, regardless of what discipline you're in, you're going to be doing some kind of HR activity. Moving on to the next slide, the career issues in HR, there are a whole host of different competencies that HR professionals need to have to be able to contribute to the bottom line of the company. And some of those include being able to understand the business that the company's in, to understand the company strategy in and of itself, be able to make contributions to the company strategy. They need to be able to understand how to create, design HR activities to meet both the employer and the employee's needs. They should be savvy with technology and HR issues. They also need to have good personal credibility as they build relationships with people all over the company. most important of all, which is really more of a subset of issues under business knowledge, is that a good HR professional understands numbers and metrics. I know it's sort of been this, you know, belief that people go into HR because they like working with people. And in fact, that's not necessarily the case. People go into HR because they like to design systems and they like to be able to make sure that people are achieving what they need to achieve, that they are, the company is accomplishing what it sets out to accomplish. And as we talk about metrics, you'll understand that, in order to do and design appropriate metrics to assess whether or not the company is successful, we need to ensure that HR understands statistics and basic math, that they know how to do means and averages and standard deviations and regression equations and correlation coefficients and things like that. As you get into more advanced HR classes, you'll be taught those advanced statistical basics, the basics of those advanced statistical methods. But understanding math is a really important part of dealing with HR issues. Moving on to the next slide, which is page 5, there are a number of different ways that you can get involved in human resource management in the company if you want to be an HR professional. Generalist is someone who's involved in a whole variety of activities and they understand the interplay between all of those particular activities. A specialist, though, decides that I'm really only interested in staffing or hiring people, so my job is involved with just this narrow area of making sure I understand how to hire the right people. So you can be a generalist or a specialist in HR. Generalists tend to either be at the top level, where they're at the highest level because they have to understand strategy and things like that. Specialists are more likely to be in larger organizations where the company has a really wide variety of HR professionals that work for them, and it makes it easier for them to specialize in a particular area. If you're in a small business, you're more likely to be a generalist because it's usually only 1 or 2 people doing all the HR stuff in the HR department. In terms of professional organizations, the Society for Human Resource Management is the largest professional organization. There's also the International HRIM. There's the IPMA, ASTD, which is actually now Association for Talent Development, ATD. There's also World at Work Association. So there's a whole lot of professional organizations out there. There's, professional organizations for people who are involved in compensation as well. SHRM is the most prevalent, the largest professional organization. And they do all sorts of assurances of learning, tests to make sure that you understand HR activities. So if you want to be an HR professional, you can go and get some testing done through SHRM, and they'll certify that you learned the things that a good HR professional is supposed to know as they graduate. In terms of general certifications, there's also the HRCI. The HRCI certifies people to be a professional in HR, a senior professional in HR, or a global professional in HR. All these are different levels. They have different requirements. So if you want to have a certification like somebody has a CPA or, chartered financial manager, the SPHR, the PHR are examples of how those kind of certifications are done within the human resource function. Along with the SPHR, GPHR, and PHR, the Human Resources Certification Institute also offers the Associate in HR, which is usually an exam that new graduates can take, so they can certify that they learned what they needed to learn to be a successful entry-level employee, and SIUE does offer courses in that if you're interested. The next slide, slide 6, is the 4 types of assets or human capital that the four types of assets that we use. Human capital is only one of them, and human capital is really how we use people and their talents and capabilities. They're a resource that we have to use in order for the organization to be able to perform the tasks that it wants to do. We also have things like physical plant, right? We need to have buildings and computers and vehicles and land in order to be able to do what we need to do to get our job done, to make the products and services for our customers. We need money, so we need financial resources. We need cash or stock or bonds or securities of some sort in order to be able to finance what we do with the business. And then lastly, we also have intangible things like our information system or patents and things like that. These are more intangible. It's a way of capitalizing on the intellectual property of people, and then we operationalize it in a patent or an information system. The interesting thing, though, is that people are the only resource that has a mind of its own. You know, buildings do what you tell them to do. Money, when you put money in the bank earns, the money earns interest in the bank. It might be a low interest rate these days, but it's an interest nonetheless. Intangible benefits, right? Patents behave the way they're supposed to be for a certain period of time. You utilize your patents, and then eventually those patents expire, and then things become, you know, in the public domain. But humans are the only people that wake up on Monday morning and decide whether or not they want to go into work, and decide how hard they want to work, and decide what things they want to do or not do. And that's not to say that people are belligerent all the time and that they don't want to do work. That's not the case. But what you need to understand in terms of managing people is they have their own ideas and their own opinions and their own experiences and expertise. And interpersonal relationships also play a really important role in this. So when it comes to human capital, the goal here is they're the only resource that can tell you that they don't want to work today. Everything else will comply. So that makes managing people very different than it takes to manage physical plant or money or intangible resources, right? People are messy. People are complex. People are not simple and easy to predict how they behave. What one person is motivated by, another person is not motivated by. They want something else. We can't always treat people the same because their expectations are going to be very different. Obviously, within the grounds of the law and being fair to people, we want to treat everybody the same. But at the same time, we also have to recognize that, we do need to make sure that we recognize what might be considered fair for one person is not fair to another. So the overall goal as we get into our discussion about motivation this week is for you to understand that there are different ways to motivate people. There are different things that motivate people. And it's important that you recognize that managing people is not the same as managing money in a bank or managing your land and your computers, right? People are more complex than that. Page 7, or slide 7, is one of my favorite Dilbert cartoons, and you can read there to see what it is. But, the bottom line is Alice is asking why this guy is qualified to be a manager because he has an MBA, and she asked him what he learned in his studies, and he didn't learn how to motivate people. He didn't learn how to hire the right people. He didn't know how to negotiate, to think strategically, or to do business writing, communication, and things like that. He said he learned finance, accounting, and economics. And so basically what Alice says is you're a highly qualified leader because you're good at math. And of course the guy is a little confused, but the lesson to be taken away from this, it's not that finance and accounting and economics are not important. In fact, they're incredibly important. We can't do our business without money. We need to make sure that we keep strict control over our numbers, and we know what's going on. We need to understand supply and demand so that we can sell our products. But what we also need to do, equally as important, is motivating our employees who decide Monday morning not to wake up and go to work. Right? We need to get them motivated so they do want to come into work. We need to be able to hire the right people. We need to be able to negotiate with our customers and with our employees. We need to be able to think at a strategic level so that we understand the big picture. And all of these things are important. So HR is not better or worse than any other discipline. It's equally as important to other disciplines because it provides a really important service in terms of helping us to manage the messy people that come into our organization and all have different needs and desires. Our next slide is the HR system model. And the HR system model is broken down to a number of different levels. But at the highest level, we see the external environment. And in that external environment are things like our customers and our competitors and the impact of technology and government regulations and the labor force and things like that. And the two-way arrow there indicates to us that what goes on in that external environment impacts the organization. What goes on in the organization impacts the external environment. When we get into the discussion on strategic HR, you'll understand a little bit more about that external versus internal environment in a little bit more detail. But this is, generally speaking, I think you understand the difference between the stuff that goes on outside of the boundaries of the company and the stuff that goes on within. And that's stuff you should have learned in Management 330, which is understanding the business environment and how those boundaries basically work. At the top of the organization, inside the organization, are things like the company's mission and goals and strategies and policies. All of these things influence what the organization does on a daily basis. We have a particular mission, we set goals based on that mission, we have strategies and tactics that we use in order to accomplish those goals. So all these things, again, influence the organization. And as I said, we'll talk more about that as we get to the discussion on strategy. But as we flow down, you notice on the left-hand side of that diagram, we have financial systems, sales and marketing, operations, manufacturing, accounting, and control. HR is a system like any of those other disciplines. And within the HR system, there is a flow of the way things work in HR. And as we go through this course, we'll be going through that diagram so you have a sense of how planning and implementation and the outcomes, all of our HR activities go through this pretty clear process, right? We start with the planning phase, and in the planning phase, we need to plan and forecast how many employees we're going to need. We need to plan for the types of jobs we need and redesign them and make sure we've got job descriptions that accurately reflect what those jobs are. We need to sort of help our employees do career planning and things like that. So that's the planning phase. As we get into the implementation phase, we take what we learned from that planning phase and then we implement it in the kind of people that we hire. How do we recruit them? How do we hire them? How do we decide who is the best employee for the job so that we can have enough employees to meet the company's demands? We need to be able to pay people appropriately for their jobs, for their skills, pay them a competitive wage. Then we have performance management. How do we manage people's performance? How do we keep them performing at a level that we want? And part of what we have to do is we have to do discipline, right? To discipline people when they don't follow company rules. We need to evaluate their performance to make sure they're performing at the level that we expect. We also need to set up things like counseling and employee assistance programs, because when people have problems, when they have concerns, when they have challenges going on in their life, the counseling and employee assistance programs help them to take care of those challenging issues so that they can do a better job of focusing on their work. So an important part of performance management is ensuring that we have assistance programs and benefits available for our employees to get help when they need help. If they have alcohol or drug problems, or if they have depression issues or health issues, whatever that is, we have systems in place to make them a better worker, to help them to become a better worker. Another aspect of performance management I consider an important part of performance management is called training and development. And in the development side, we train employees on the skills they need to do their job today, and then we develop them to help them develop a particular career, where they want to go and what direction they want to head into. So developing people is developing them with the company strategy in mind to make sure that we have the employees we need in the future to do our work and to help them create a career path that works for them. The last aspect that we should consider is labor relations. Now, labor relations involves whether or not a company has a union. If you have a union, then many of the HR activities that you do are guided by what we call the collective bargaining agreement. And that collective bargaining agreement tells us what people get paid, how many hours they're supposed to work, what the working conditions will look like, those sorts of things. Even if you don't have a working union in your company, you need to be aware that there's always the potential a union could organize your company. It's important for you to recognize that the union will come in if the employees are unhappy with the organization and if the employees don't believe that the company has their best interests at heart. And so your job in HR is to be aware of whether or not your employees are disgruntled, whether or not they're getting their needs met, whether or not they feel like the organization is treating them poorly or unfairly, because then that increases the likelihood a union may try to organize them. So the goal here is that if you are unionized, labor relations obviously has a huge impact on what you do on a daily basis. But if you're not organized, you always need to be aware of how to manage the systems that you have to minimize the risk that a union will try to organize your employees. Right, so that's sort of the planning and the implementation phase. Now we move on to the outcomes and evaluation. This is metrics, right? These are, how do we know we're successful? How do we know that the company is achieving what it set out to achieve? How do we know HR is doing the job that it's supposed to do? So we look at things like profitability and productivity and, how stable our workforce is. Are people leaving? Are they turning over? Or are we retaining good quality people? Do we have a lot of lawsuits? Do we have union problems? Do we have, health and safety issues and working conditions? So all of these are essential that we understand, because if we don't have good working conditions and we don't have a stable workforce, this is going to be very difficult for us to be successful as a company. So our outcomes and evaluations are the way that we assess whether or not our planning and implementation in HR was actually as successful as we wanted it to be. And when it is, then that really helps. All right. So this system model will be reinforced throughout the course. You'll get to see this model again and again to make sure that you understand what role each of these functions play, and also to make sure that you understand where we are in the process of explaining our HR function as we go through the material in the course. Our last two slides, trying to get at things like why you should take this course. And I think I've already implied that HR is much more involved now in more strategic initiatives, right? They're more involved in how can we use our employees to the best of our competitive advantage, to create a competitive advantage. What skills do they have? How can we utilize those skills to be more productive, to be more creative? So HR doesn't really do the day-to-day stuff. They don't do performance appraisals. They design systems, right? But they don't do the actual HR tasks. Managers are really left to do that. And in fact, 80% of a manager or a leader's time is really spent on people issues. So managers, which could be any one of you as you graduate and move on to your first job, they need to be familiar with the laws. They need to be familiar with day-to-day HR activities. The legal environment is really challenging, and we need to make sure that everybody who works in an organization is familiar with the HR and employment laws, and they're familiar with the challenges that may arise from not paying attention to your legal issues. So moving on then to the changing role of HR, as I said, currently really, and into the future, strategy plays a much more important role in the HR function itself. They are much more involved in strategic planning. The operational or advocacy kind of stuff has remained fairly stable over time, but the administrative stuff, the things like the paperwork and the doing the performance appraisals and making sure we've got a compensation system that works, HR is spending less time on the actual administration of those systems, and management is doing much more of that. So as you can see, we've gone from 50% of an HR professional's job was spent doing administrating HR policies they're much more involved in the strategy, and the administration really falls on the managers to do this. They do the performance appraisals. They are involved in interviewing people. They're evaluating people and interviewing people. They're doing all sorts of different things. So it's really important that you guys understand how these functions work and make sure that you are prepared to take on this role when you enter an organization. So that's the introduction to HR. And when you're done, move on to the next lecture. Thank you.